The M4A1 wasn't built to be the perfect weapon. It was built to be manageable. That difference won every war it entered. The M4A1 carbine wasn't adopted because it was the best option available. It was adopted because it fit into something larger than itself. A standardized system that could be trained, supplied, and modified across dozens of units simultaneously. For USSOCOM, that mattered more than raw performance. The M4A1 became the core not by outperforming competitors, but by surviving them, absorbing optics, laser aiming modules, suppressors, and infrared gear, while still being recognizable as the same platform underneath. But there was always a cost. Every accessory added weight to the front end, shifted the balance, and turned a compact carbine into something an operator carried for 8 hours straight in 40-degree heat. The metal got hot fast under sustained fire, and the 5.56 round, fine for most contacts, started showing its limits the moment a target ducked behind something solid. The Mark 18 CQBR was the first honest answer to that limitation. Not a replacement, a fork. SOF realized that the same platform with a 10.3-inch barrel behaved like an entirely different weapon in close quarters. Lighter at the muzzle, faster to clear a doorway, easier to swing through a corridor without catching on a frame. Ships, stairwells, vehicle interiors, entry points. This was its world. But the physics were unforgiving. The shorter barrel spiked muzzle flash, increased gas pressure back through the suppressor, and hammered the shooter's ears and eyes with every trigger pull in an enclosed space. Effective range dropped noticeably. What the Mark 18 gained in control, it surrendered in reach, and that was accepted as a deliberate trade, not a flaw to be corrected. When 5.56 stopped being enough, the Mark 17 SCAR H entered the picture. The shift to 7.62 by 51 wasn't romantic, it was mechanical. Barriers that absorbed 5.56 rounds started failing against heavier projectiles. Targets at 400 meters became reliably stoppable rather than probabilistic. The SCAR H brought modularity as a real engineering argument. Quick change barrels, folding stock, familiar manual of arms. What it also brought was weight in every direction: the rifle, the magazines, the ammunition. An operator carrying a SCAR H with a full combat load was making a trade. More energy on target, less energy left in his legs. The Mark 20 SSR closed Part 1 by pushing the same platform into designated marksman territory, built on SCAR H internals but tuned for precision. Heavier barrel, match-grade trigger, longer sight radius. It sat in the gap between the carbine world and a proper sniper system, giving a small element reach without pulling a dedicated sniper from the team. In theory, that was efficient. In the field, it meant carrying a system that was longer, heavier, and less tolerant of rough handling than any of the carbines before it, and demanding of a shooter who had to think like a marksman, while the rest of the group was still moving like assaulters. The split of roles that began with the M4A1 wasn't a clean division. It was a fracture that kept spreading. And the next question was range. The M110A1 arrived at a moment when USSOCOM had already accepted that probing marksman roles with carbine-length platforms was an engineering compromise, not a solution. This was the semi-automatic answer built for a different rhythm. Not the burst of a doorway entry, but the measured spacing of a 600-meter engagement, where the shooter needs a fast second round without resetting a bolt. The M110A1, chambered in 6.5 Creedmoor, gave operators a flatter trajectory, better retained energy at distance, and enough barrel length to make the optic worth what it cost. What it didn't give them was lightness. With suppressor, scope, bipod, and spare magazines, the complete system pressed the upper limit of what one person could carry efficiently on a long patrol. The role demanded a shooter who thought slower than the assaulters around him, and in a small team operating under time pressure, that gap between roles created friction that no amount of engineering resolved entirely. The Berets Mark 22 ASR went further, where the M110A1 extended reach within a familiar semi-auto framework. The Mark 22 was a platform designed around the concept of interchangeable roles across calibers: .300, Norma Magnum, .338. Norma Magnum, .308 Winchester. Swap the barrel, the bolt, the magazine, and the same rifle addresses a different engagement profile. On paper, that modularity reduces the number of distinct systems a unit has to train on, stock parts for, and transport. In the field, it introduces a different kind of cognitive and logistical load: the correct barrel for the correct mission, transported without damage, swapped under time pressure, zeroed again, trusted. Modularity never eliminates complexity. It redistributes it. The Mark 22 was a serious and capable system, but it demanded a support architecture around it that smaller, leaner elements couldn't always guarantee. The F.N. Herstall Mark 48 machine gun closed the second block with a different argument entirely. After 2 precision platforms, the Mark 48 reintroduced density, not accuracy, but the sustained ability to push 7.62 by 51 downrange at a rate that forces suppression, pins a position, and buys movement for the rest of the element. Weighing roughly 8.2 kilograms empty, it was lighter than the M240 family it drew from, light enough to be carried by a single operator in a direct action context. But light is relative. The belts, the spare barrel, the bipod, the heat building in the receiver after a sustained burst. All of that translated directly into what the gunner couldn't carry in place of it. A 7.62 machine gun in a 6-man team changes the weight math for everyone, not just the shooter. And yet the Mark 48 stayed, because what it offered, the ability to suppress a hardened position across 800 meters without calling for external fire support, was something no carbine or precision rifle in the group could replicate. When reach and accuracy were already covered, what was still missing was raw, sustained fire. That gap didn't close itself. The F.N. Herstall Mark 13 EGLM/FN40GL didn't replace a rifle. It changed what a rifle could threaten. A target behind a wall, inside a window frame, crouched in a drainage ditch. These weren't difficult shots because of distance. They were difficult because a direct fire round needed a direct line, and the geometry of urban combat rarely offered one. The 40mm grenade launcher, mounted under the carbine, handed the operator a second answer to that geometry. An arcing trajectory that reached around corners and over barriers that no bullet would touch. In SOF doctrine, this wasn't a fire support weapon. It was a micro-decision tool, used in the first seconds of contact to break a position before it could consolidate. The cost was immediate and physical. The front end of the carbine became heavier. The balance shifted forward, and the weapon that had felt alive in the hands during a room entry now pulled differently at the muzzle. Each 40mm round carried its own weight in the load, and operators counted them carefully because there were never enough for every situation and always too many for comfortable movement. The Knight's Armament, Mark 11 Mod 0, represented something less obvious than a new caliber or a new role. It represented a shift in how SOF thought about the people inside a small team. Someone had to slow down, observe farther, and hold a sector while the rest of the element moved. The Mark 11 Mod 0, a semi-automatic 7.6, 2x51 precision rifle built on an AR pattern receiver, gave that person a system that could engage with real confidence at 600 to 800 meters without the tempo penalty of a bolt action. What it required in return was a shooter who could operate at a different cognitive pace than the assaulters around him, reading wind, tracking a moving target through a scope, making a cold shot under pressure. The platform itself was demanding, sensitive to carbon buildup, heavy with a full optic package, and long enough to become a liability in any confined space. But it established a culture inside SOF that outlasted the rifle itself. The idea that precision at intermediate range wasn't a sniper's luxury, it was a team resource. The Knight's Armament, Mark 12 SPR, asked a harder question. How much accuracy could be pulled out of a 5.56 platform before the cartridge itself became the ceiling? The answer was more than most expected. With an 18-inch heavy match barrel, a tuned free-float rail, and quality ammunition, the Mark 12 extended the effective engagement range of a 5.56 rifle into territory that standard carbines couldn't reliably reach. For units already carrying 5.56 logistics, this was genuinely attractive. No new caliber, no new spare parts ecosystem, just a longer, more precise instrument built from familiar components. The friction was equally familiar: length that compromised vehicle movement and building entry, weight that accumulated under a full optic and suppressor, and a hard ballistic ceiling that no barrel profile could push through. When targets required more energy than a 5.56 could deliver, behind intermediate barriers, at extreme range, in adverse wind, the Mark 12 hit that ceiling cleanly and without apology. It was the most precise version of a light platform that engineering could produce. It was still a light platform. The Accuracy International Mark 13, chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum, entered the SOF inventory, not as an upgrade to the precision rifles before it, but as an acknowledgement that some distances simply weren't negotiable. At ranges where the Mark 12 ran out of energy and the Mark 11 started losing confidence, the .300 Win Mag cartridge still carried enough velocity and terminal performance to matter. The bolt-action architecture, slower, heavier, less forgiving of rushed handling, was the price paid for that reliability. Every shot from a Mark 13 was a deliberate act. A stable position found and held, a range card built, a wind call made, a breath controlled. None of that was compatible with the pace of the assaulters in the same element. The sniper pair operating this system existed in a separate tempo from the rest of the team, moving less, observing longer, consuming more time on every engagement. That separation was the point. When a target appeared at 1,100 meters in open terrain, no other system in the group had a credible answer. The Mark 13 did. The cost was carried in the shooter's back, in the logistical tale of a caliber that no one else in the unit shared, and in the operational planning required to integrate a slow, precise element into a fast-moving operation. The Mark 15.50 caliber sniper weapon system moved the conversation past the human target entirely. At the distances and against the target sets where a .50 BMG platform becomes relevant, radar components, parked aircraft, crew-served weapons, communications equipment, vehicle engines, the rifle was no longer a personal weapon in any meaningful sense. It was a portable destructive instrument that happened to be shoulder-fired. The engagement profiles it served were narrow and specific, targets that required physical destruction rather than incapacitation, at distances where lighter anti-materiel options ran short. In those narrow scenarios, it was irreplaceable. Outside them, it was a system that weighed over 12 kilograms unloaded, demanded a two-man carry in most practical configurations, required significant time and space to emplace, and consumed a booming, position-revealing round that left no ambiguity about where the shot came from. SOF units that carried it did so with deliberate intent, for a deliberate target, on a deliberate mission. It was never background equipment. The Berets M107 occupied a similar anti-materiel space, but introduced semi-automatic fire into the heavy caliber equation. 10 rounds in a detachable box magazine, faster follow-up capability, and a recoil-reducing system that made the .50 BMG more manageable under repeat firing. These were genuine advantages in scenarios where a single destructive shot wasn't enough. But the M107 was still 14 kilograms of rifle before optics, ammunition, and carrying equipment. The semi-automatic mechanism added mechanical complexity that the bolt-action class avoided entirely. And the scenarios where rapid .50 caliber follow-up fire proved decisive were narrow enough that many units accepted the simpler, lighter bolt-action alternative for most taskings. The M107 was powerful, proven, and genuinely useful. And in the right hands, against the right target, at the right moment, it closed problems that nothing else in a small element could close. That conditional framing was never accidental. The most capable systems in the SOF inventory were always the most conditional in their effectiveness. The Remington M2010ESR proved something uncomfortable about modernization. Newer architecture doesn't automatically win. When the Army began replacing the aging M24 family, the M2010 entered service chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum, the same cartridge the Mark 13 had validated in SOF use. With a folding stock, an adjustable chassis, and a suppressor as standard issue rather than an afterthought. It was a bolt-action rifle that had absorbed 20 years of lessons from the field and built them into the frame. The fold made helicopter insertion manageable, the chassis adjusted to the shooter's geometry, instead of demanding the shooter adapt to the stock. The suppressor reduced the acoustic signature that had historically given away a sniper's position faster than the bullet itself. None of this made the M2010 faster, lighter, or less demanding of patience. It was still a precision bolt action system that required time, stillness, and a partner working the spotting scope. But within those constraints, it performed with a consistency that semi-automatic alternatives at comparable range couldn't reliably match. SOCOM kept bolt-action platforms not out of nostalgia, out of arithmetic, first-round hit probability at distance, in cold conditions with no prior data, still favored the simpler mechanical cycle. The FN Herstall Mark 46 light machine gun was the machine gun that a small team could actually carry without restructuring around it. Stripped of the heavy barrel assembly and bipod legs of its larger sibling, the Mark 48, the Mark 46 ran 5.56 by 45 from a disintegrating belt and weighed under 4.7 kilograms empty. Less than many carbine configurations with full accessory loads. For a 6-man direct action element that needed organic suppression capability without dedicating a third of its personnel to feed and carry a 7.62 system, this was a practical answer. The gunner could move with the element instead of anchoring a support position. The caliber limitation was real. 5.56 couldn't reliably suppress a hardened position at 700 meters the way the Mark 48 could. But inside the distances where most SOF engagements actually occurred, the Mark 46 generated enough volume to pin a position, cover a withdrawal, or hold a flank, while the rest of the team repositioned. It was a weapon designed around what operators could physically sustain over a full mission cycle, not around what looked most capable on a range card. The Saab Bofors Dynamics, Maus/Carl Gustaf, 84mm closed, Part 5. By changing the category of problem, a small element could solve on its own. Every weapon before it in this series worked within the physics of a projectile fired from a tube toward a point target. The Carl Gustaf worked in a different register. Walls, vehicles, crew-served weapon positions, fortified structures, obstacles that required explosive energy to remove rather than penetration to defeat. In Afghanistan and Iraq, SOF elements used it against fighting positions that small arms fire couldn't neutralize, against compound walls that needed breaching, against technical vehicles that arrived without warning. The system fired a range of projectiles: heat, HEDP, illumination, smoke, thermobaric, that made it genuinely multi-role in a way few portable systems matched. The weight of each round, the backblast danger zone that demanded spatial awareness before every shot, the 2-man operation under stress. These weren't design flaws. They were the physics of carrying something that could collapse a reinforced position from 500 meters. No one carried the Carl Gustaf casually. They carried it because at some point in the mission, nothing else would do. The Namo/M72, M72, A7/M72, A9LAW survived decades of procurement cycles and budget reviews because it solved a specific problem with a logic that more sophisticated systems couldn't replicate. One operator, one tube, one shot. No maintenance history, no return trip. The M72 entered Vietnam as a lightweight anti-armor option and outlasted the era that created it by finding new relevance against the target sets of later wars. Light fortifications, crew-served positions, doorways that needed to stop being doorways. The A7 and A9 variants added an extended standoff capability and an improved fuse, making the system viable against soft-skinned vehicles and prepared fighting positions in ways the original design hadn't anticipated. What it never became was a complex system. There was nothing to zero, nothing to battery check, nothing to service between missions. An operator carried it as a contingency, deployed it when the situation demanded, and discarded the tube on the ground behind him. In a world of modular platforms and multi-caliber sniper systems, that simplicity wasn't a limitation. It was an argument that some tactical problems deserve a disposable answer. the Cadillac Gauge/Stoner, Stoner 63/Mark 23, belonged to a different war and a different logic, but it left a mark on SOF culture that outlasted the hardware itself. In Vietnam, Navy SEALs adopted the Stoner 63 in its light machine gun configuration because it gave them a volume of 5.56 fire that no individual weapon in their inventory matched, at a weight the team could absorb without collapsing its mobility. The system was modular before modularity became doctrine. The same core receiver could be configured as a rifle, a carbine, a belt-fed automatic, or a fixed vehicle mount. In the jungle, on riverine operations, in ambushes where the first 3 seconds of contact determined the outcome, the Stoner delivered. It also jammed, corroded, and demanded meticulous cleaning that the operational tempo of Vietnam didn't always allow. The SEALs who trusted it understood both sides of that equation and used it anyway. That willingness to accept a difficult system for a specific tactical advantage became part of how SOF units approached unconventional equipment. Not as users of whatever was issued, but as operators who evaluated tools against the specific violence they expected to encounter. The Colt M16 rifle family was never a SOF weapon specifically, but SOF grew out of it. The ergonomics, the manual of arms, the instinct for where the controls were without looking. Every carbine in this series, every designated marksman platform built on an AR receiver, every suppressor thread pattern that matched without an adapter traced its lineage back to the M16 family. It established the baseline from which every deviation in this list was measured. Operators who trained on it carried its muscle memory into every subsequent platform. That continuity had real operational value. Less cognitive load during transition, faster integration of new systems, a shared language of handling that required no translation across units. The Glock 19 closed the list not with ceremony, but with honesty. A pistol in a SOF context was rarely the primary answer to any tactical problem. It was the answer when every other answer had failed or run dry. The Glock 19 earned its place not through ballistic performance or extended range, but through a combination of qualities that mattered most under the worst conditions. Consistent ignition regardless of maintenance state, a grip that fit a wide range of hand sizes and glove configurations, a trigger with no external safety to snag under stress, and a parts supply so deep that keeping one running required almost no institutional effort. It rode in a holster through operations where it was never fired, and occasionally, at a distance measured in feet rather than meters, in a room where everything else had stopped working, it was the only tool left. That possibility, rare but real, justified every gram.